What's your answer?
My answer is something called science.
Hello there. In this video, I'm going to analyze Ben Shapiro's science argument against abortion, and I'm going to argue for two claims. First, that it fails to justify its conclusion, since it relies on a highly controversial moral premise that we've got no good reason to accept. And second, that it's very badly named, since the science aspect is only a very small part of the argument. If you're going to call an argument for a moral conclusion the science argument, then any moral premise in it should be relatively obvious and uncontroversial, and that's simply not the case here. The moral premise is not at all obvious and very controversial, and science is completely silent on the matter. Okay, let's get to it. Now, by calling this Ben Shapiro's science argument, I don't mean to imply that he came up with it himself. However, he definitely likes this argument and he appeals to it quite frequently. Here's him discussing the various arguments for the pro-life position in an interview on his channel with conservative activist Liz Wheeler.
I want to ask you what you think are the most convincing arguments in favor of the pro-life position. Because there's the moral argument that's made, there's the scientific argument that's made. What do you think has been the most effective move by pro-life advocates?
Now, I find it a bit weird to speak as if there's a moral argument and then a separate scientific argument for the pro-life position, right? If you're making an argument for the claim that abortion is wrong or should be banned, then these are all moral arguments. They're going to need at least one moral premise. But maybe the idea is that in the scientific argument, the moral premise is relatively obvious and uncontroversial. Either way, I'm pretty sure Ben Shapiro is aware that he needs moral premises even in the scientific argument. Here's him expressing the science argument in an interview with BBC's Andrew Neil.
Why is it that a bill banning abortions after a woman has been pregnant for 6 weeks is not a return to the Dark Ages? What's your answer?
My answer is something called science. Human life exists at conception. It ought to be protected.
Okay, so now let's attempt to charitably reconstruct the argument, okay? So here's the science argument, argument A. We're going to need to go through a couple versions. Premise A1, science says that life begins at conception. Premise A2, if science says that life begins at conception, then life begins at conception. Then we're trying to get to the moral conclusion that abortion is always wrong. Now, I've included the word always in the conclusion here, since I think this was the claim that Ben Shapiro was trying to defend, at least in the BBC interview. He was asked a question about the justification for bans on early abortions, and so it makes sense that he'd be arguing for the claim that abortion is always wrong, even in an early pregnancy. Now, this conclusion doesn't follow from these premises alone, so we're going to need some more premises to get there. So here's what I've added as the premises to get us to this conclusion. Premise A3, if life begins at conception, then abortion ends an innocent human life. And premise A4, it's always wrong to end an innocent human life. Now, as you saw in the interview, Ben Shapiro expressed his moral premise as human life ought to be protected. However, I think he would accept A4 as a reasonable reconstruction of his claim. Now we have a valid argument where the premises entail the conclusion, so the question is, should we accept these premises? Now, I'm not going to say much about premise A1, okay? I haven't looked into the science on the matter, so I'm just going to grant this premise. I'm going to grant that science really does say this, that life begins at conception. Let's take a look at premise A2. If science says that life begins at conception, then life begins at conception. Now, I think the idea behind this premise is that if science says something on a scientific matter, then it's probably true. Now, I won't quibble with that general principle, but I do think it might get Ben Shapiro or some of his conservative friends into trouble on some other issues. I do want to mention one potential problem with this premise, or premises like it. Sometimes things seem like a purely scientific or empirical matter, but often there are some issues of language or metaphysics underlying it, okay? For instance, in this case, we could ask, what exactly do we mean by life, right? Which process do we mean to pick out by that term in this context? And is that the process that's relevant to these moral issues? There might be a number of different processes that start at a number of different times, so we have to make sure we're focusing on the one that matters to morality. However, I won't press this objection, okay? I'm going to grant premise A1 and A2 since I want to focus on the moral aspect of this argument. We can grant premise A3, if life begins at conception, then abortion ends an innocent human life. Now, we've put the word innocent in there, and we can also grant that. We have to make sure, though, by innocent we mean faultless, right? Not at fault for the situation. There's another interpretation of innocent on which it means not infringing on anyone's rights. And that's not clear. That's far from obvious. It's far from obvious that the fetus, in this case, is not infringing on somebody's rights. In fact, many of us would argue that they are, right? They're not at fault for the situation. They're faultless, but there's a pretty good case to make that they're infringing on somebody's rights. So let's make sure that when we read the word innocent here, we understand that to mean not at fault or faultless. And then we can grant this premise. Now let's look at the key moral premise here. Premise A4. It's always wrong to end an innocent human life. And remember that I said, if an argument like this for a moral conclusion deserves to be called the science argument, then the science aspect of it should be the important part, or the controversial part. Any moral component should be relatively uncontroversial. And I think this premise is just very controversial, and it's far from obvious. I think all it takes is a little bit of imagination, and you can come up with some highly plausible counterexamples. Now, I've already discussed in great detail the challenges to a moral premise like A4. Okay? Click this link to see that video. The basic idea is there are circumstances in which another individual, through no fault of their own, is infringing on your rights in some way, or posing a threat to you. Maybe they're posing a threat to your life, or your freedom of movement, or your bodily autonomy, and the only way to protect yourself from this threat involves ending their life. Now, I think most people are going to find it plausible that it's actually not wrong to end an innocent human life in those cases. So that shows that a premise like this is open to some plausible counterexamples. Arguably the most famous counterexample to a premise like this comes from philosopher Judith Jarvis Thomson's paper, A Defense of Abortion, referenced below. Now, if you haven't already read this paper, I recommend doing so, but I'm going to let Ben explain this case to you.
The counter-argument that you usually hear is the so-called famous violinist case.
Right.
I'm sure you've heard this one before.
Yeah. I've heard your takedown of it as well.
Yeah, exactly. From the 1970s, very famous philosophy paper, and
Yeah.
it basically suggests, okay, so you wake up in a room, and next to you is a famous violinist who's been hooked into your veins, and do you have an obligation not to unhook this famous violinist if this famous violinist is going to die absent the IV?
Okay, so whether or not Ben accepts this as a counterexample, it seems like we do have a pretty good counterexample to the claim that it's always wrong to end an innocent human life, right? By unplugging yourself from the violinist, you'd be ending an innocent human life, but it doesn't seem wrong to do so in that case. So that shows us that we need to revise this argument, and in particular, we need to revise the moral premise to get around such counterexamples. So that brings us to the second version of the science argument, or argument B. Premise B1, science says that life begins at conception. Premise B2, if science says that life begins at conception, then life begins at conception. Same first two premises. Now we have a new premise. Premise B3, if life begins at conception, then abortion ends an innocent human life that you have an obligation to protect. Premise B4, it's always wrong to end an innocent human life that you have an obligation to protect. Conclusion, so abortion is always wrong. Okay, so now, premise B4, the key moral premise, is more or less fine, right? We've added this clause. We say, it's always wrong to end an innocent human life that you have an obligation to protect. This protects us against the violinist counterexample, since in that case, arguably, you don't have an obligation to protect the violinist's life. So we can accept B4, it's more or less fine, but now notice that B3 is highly controversial, since we've smuggled in a moral component here. If life begins at conception, then abortion ends an innocent human life that you have an obligation to protect. Now it's asserting that you have an obligation to protect this life, and that's a very controversial claim. So what I'm going to do is rewrite this argument so that we can isolate the controversial moral component. Okay, so that brings us to argument C. Premise C1, science says that life begins at conception. Premise C2, if science says that life begins at conception, then life begins at conception. Premise C3, if life begins at conception, then abortion ends an innocent human life. Here's the controversial premise. C4, if abortion ends an innocent human life, it is an innocent human life that you have an obligation to protect. Premise C5, it's always wrong to end an innocent human life that you have an obligation to protect. Conclusion, so abortion is always wrong. Okay, so now we've isolated the highly controversial moral component into premise C4. And the question is, why should we accept this premise? Why should we accept that in this case, right, in the case of abortion, it's an innocent human life that you have an obligation to protect? What's the justification behind the claim that you do have this obligation to protect this life? Well, I'm going to let Ben attempt to explain it to us. In his response to the violinist case, he gives us an argument for a premise a lot like this.
Do you have an obligation not to unhook this famous violinist if this famous violinist is going to die absent the IV? Well, the argument there, of course, is that like a rape or incest case, in that particular case, you didn't will this person to be connected with you.
Right.
In case of consensual sex, obviously one of the risks of consensual sex is that you will indeed get pregnant, but if you had no choice in the matter, then it looks a little bit more like this particular case.
Okay, so we're going to take the ideas that he expressed there in order to formulate the final version of the science argument. Argument D. Premise D1, science says that life begins at conception. Premise D2, if science says that life begins at conception, then life begins at conception. Premise D3, if life begins at conception, then abortion ends an innocent human life. And here we have a new premise. D4, if abortion ends an innocent human life, it is an innocent human life resulting as a foreseeable risk from your voluntary action. Premise D5, you have an obligation to protect any innocent human life resulting as a foreseeable risk from your voluntary action. Premise D6, it's always wrong to end an innocent human life that you have an obligation to protect. Conclusion, so abortion is always wrong. Okay, now let's look at the new premises here, premises D4 and D5. D4 says, if abortion ends an innocent human life, it is an innocent human life resulting as a foreseeable risk from your voluntary action. Now, in order to maintain this premise here, we're probably going to have to restrict it to abortion in cases other than rape, right? In that case, it's not a result of a voluntary action. But I also know that Ben doesn't make any exceptions to the wrongness of abortion, including cases of rape, so I'm not really sure what he'd say on the matter. However, I want to focus now on premise D5, okay? This is the highly controversial moral premise. It says, you have an obligation to protect any innocent human life resulting as a foreseeable risk from your voluntary action. Now, this premise might seem pretty plausible to you on the face of it, but I think on reflection, that's not the case, okay? I think it's actually highly controversial and not at all obvious. I think it's open to some pretty compelling counterexamples. Now, in another video, I've argued against a premise like this, okay? Click this link to see that video. Also, in Thomson's paper, she discusses some counterexamples to premises like this. In particular, her people seeds case seems like a pretty plausible one. The basic idea behind any such counterexample is this. Suppose that, for whatever reason, there was a chance of innocent human lives resulting from certain voluntary actions we tend to take in our daily life. For instance, maybe there are evil scientists running around conducting illicit experiments, and if we go to the park or go to a football game or go to an art gallery, there's a chance of some evil scientist kidnapping you, creating a human clone, and implanting it in your body. Also, suppose this is common knowledge. Suppose we all know about this risk of these evil scientists doing these weird things. Then, by going to the park, or going to a football game, or going to an art gallery, we're taking a voluntary action which has a foreseeable risk of resulting in an innocent human life. Does that mean that just because we go to the park, or go to a football game, or go to an art gallery, and these evil scientists kidnap us and implant a human clone in us, does that mean we now have an obligation to protect this innocent human life? Well, you could say that, but that's very unclear. That's far from obvious. Seems pretty implausible to me, and I expect many of you to find that pretty implausible. So what this shows is that this premise is open to some fairly plausible counterexamples. Again, maybe some of you will reject these counterexamples. Maybe you think that actually, yes, you do have an obligation to protect these innocent human lives that resulted from your voluntary action of going to the park or going to a football game or going to an art gallery. But at the very least, it's a very controversial claim. And I expect many people to not find that very plausible. So whatever you think about those cases, I think this shows that premise D5 is not obvious. Now, I'm not going to argue in great detail here that D5 is false. But all I'm going to say here is that this premise is extremely controversial and requires a substantial defense. I think, again, all it takes is a little bit of imagination, a little bit of creativity to come up with some pretty plausible counterexamples to this premise. And unless you've really reflected and thought about such cases, you're not justified in accepting this premise. So that's why I think this science argument fails to justify its conclusion. In particular, because it has this highly controversial moral premise, D5, that we've got no good reason to accept absent a substantial argument. And Ben Shapiro hasn't really given us one. He seems to think this premise is just obvious, but that's simply not the case. Now, another thing I want to say about this science argument is that now that we have the full version in front of us, it should seem a bit weird that we're calling it the science argument at all, right? The appeal to science only occurs in premises D1 and D2. And there's a lot of controversial stuff happening in the other parts, in the moral parts. Now, to further defend the claim that this is badly labeled, I want to compare two different arguments that you might call science arguments. First, we have a simple version of Ben Shapiro's science argument against abortion. In this version, we're going to combine all of the moral aspects into a single premise. So here we have premise S1, science says that life begins at conception. Premise S2, if science says that life begins at conception, then life begins at conception. Now we have the moral premise, S3, if life begins at conception, then abortion is always wrong. Conclusion, so abortion is always wrong. Our moral premise is S3. All of the controversial moral assumptions are packed into that premise. Now I want to show you a different argument that might be called a science argument. Premise S1, science says that anthropogenic climate change, ACC, is an existential threat to our civilization. Premise S2 prime, if science says that ACC is an existential threat to our civilization, then it is an existential threat to our civilization. Premise S3 prime, if ACC is an existential threat to our civilization, then we should take significant measures to combat it. Conclusion, so we should take significant measures to combat anthropogenic climate change. Now, this argument has the same form as our first one, and the second premise here relies on a very similar principle as the second premise in the first one. But let's take a look at the moral premise here, okay? Premise S3 prime. If ACC is an existential threat to our civilization, then we should take significant measures to combat ACC. Now, I think the second argument is more deserving of the label a science argument than the first, because I think this moral premise is pretty uncontroversial, right? If something's an existential threat to our civilization, then we should probably take significant measures to combat it. I expect most people to agree with that premise, whatever their position is on anthropogenic climate change. However, if we look back at the first science argument, the moral premise, S3, is not uncontroversial, okay? It's not at all obvious. So that's why I think it doesn't deserve to be called a science argument. As I said earlier, I think an argument for a moral conclusion should only really be called a science argument if the moral component is totally uncontroversial. And that's just not the case in this first argument. Now, it could be that a lot of people think S3 is obvious because they haven't reflected on it very much. But I hope I've shown that upon reflection, it's not at all obvious. It's not easy to defend. It relies on some highly controversial assumptions. If you're a pro-choice person, whatever you think about the science part of the argument, I don't think you should be granting this premise S3. Okay? I think this is a premise you should be attacking. And if you're a pro-life person, you are going to have to justify this premise to make your case against abortion. All right, now let's look back at the final version of the science argument one last time. Argument D. So here it is. Now, whatever you want to say about the science aspect of this argument, premises D1 and D2, I think this argument fails to justify its conclusion because of premise D5. Premise D5 is highly controversial and not at all obvious. I think upon reflection, it's open to a great many challenges, and at the very least, it requires a substantial defense. And so that's why I think this argument fails to justify its conclusion. But if you disagree, if you think you can justify each premise here, and if you think maybe science can help you out with that, then I wish you good fortune in the culture wars to come. Now begins.